Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Aubrey Reeves, CEO of Business and Arts. Before we begin, I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am a white settler speaking to you from Toronto. I have the honor to be a guest on the traditional lands and waters of the Petun and Wendat people, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee confederacies, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as well as many other Indigenous nations, some of whose names are no longer remembered. By saying the names of its original keepers, we remember that this territory continues to be the subject to the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Throughout the year, but particularly as we mark the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation at the end of the month, we acknowledge all who came before us and have traveled the lands and waters of this territory. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, to meet, and to live on these lands. Today's session will include the latest insights from the Arts Response Tracking Survey, or ARTS. This partnership between Business and Arts, the National Arts Centre, and Nanos Research began back in May of 2020. And through quarterly surveys of over 1,000 Canadian culture-goers, our aim has been to provide the arts sector with insight into Canadians' shifting attitudes towards participating in indoor and outdoor arts and cultural events. Recognizing the evolving needs of the arts and culture sector in a quite volatile post-pandemic environment, Arts has entered a new 2-year phase. And today's session is the second installment of this renewed program. This edition of the survey was in the field in July of 2023. It looks at culture-goers' attitudes towards attending arts and cultural events, as well as motivators and patterns to volunteering for arts and culture organizations. The full report is now available in both English and French on our website, and the links to it will be available in the chat. Before we get started, there are just a couple of small housekeeping items for today's session. We're happy to have ASL interpretation for today's session. And we also have auto-generated English and French captions, which can also be turned on. Only the presenters and moderators will have our microphones on today, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box and vote for the ones you think are most relevant. The session is scheduled for 1 hour and 15 minutes to give us ample time for questions. We're starting today's session with a presentation of the research findings by Nik Nanos. As the Chief Data Scientist at Nanos Research, Nik has led thousands of research projects in Canada and around the world, ranging from market studies, customer satisfaction tracking, creative testing, program development, and reputational management. Nik has worked alongside many arts and cultural organizations, including the Ontario Arts Council, BC Arts, Ontario Culture Days, and a variety of museum and art gallery institutions. He's a research adjunct professor at the Norman Paterson School for International Affairs and a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Nik.
Hey, Aubrey, and hello, everyone. I'm just done, hopefully successfully. Aubrey, have I done a screen share properly?
Yes, you have.
Oh, thank you very much. There we go. I've got the Aubrey seal of approval to proceed. So great to virtually link in with everyone. Anyways, so it's great to see everyone, and I hope all's well. I'm really pleased to present the latest round, as Aubrey was, of the Arts Response Tracking Survey that we do with the Business and the Arts National Arts Centre. So we'll do the usual tracking on frequency of attendance, and then we're going to unpack volunteering because that's the thematic focus for this particular wave. On the attendance front, the good news is that you can see that still a pretty strong proportion of arts and culture goers have returned back to one extent or another, whether it's once a month or once every 6 months or less. The other thing is you can see that indoor events have a higher tendency or higher frequency of participation compared to museum and galleries. But, the key takeaway is that people are slowly coming back to the arts and culture activities that they love. But let's talk about volunteering for a second. And what I'd like to put on the table, just to add as context, as some of you might know, we did a pretty massive study for Canada Helps of charitable and nonprofit organizations across the country. And I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, because part of that study also had to do with volunteerism and the issues that nonprofits and charities were dealing with, and a full range of issues on volunteerism, ranging from volunteer burnout to having fewer volunteers and how organizations are coping with them. And I thought what's interesting in this particular study is, you can see at least that there are some hotspots and not so hot spots when it comes to volunteering. And what's interesting is that regionally, what you can see is that individuals, culture goers who live in the prairie provinces, were more likely to report volunteering for an arts and cultural organization in the past year. And this is in contrast. You can see that's about 66% compared to Quebec at around 81%, who said that they had never. So 66 had not in the prairies, 81% had not in Quebec. But the key takeaway is that the prairies, individuals in the prairies, were more likely to volunteer than those in Quebec. We know from some of the other research that we've done that Quebecers, and this is a small c cultural observation, Quebecers are more likely to believe that the government should be involved, and I'm sure they're probably also more likely to be that the government should be paying for individuals in arts and culture organizations, as opposed to the prairies, where there's an attitude of people more likely to proactively volunteer and step up. The other thing is that when we look at the time spent volunteering in the past year compared to the pre-pandemic level, women were more likely to report that they're volunteering less. And I think the other key takeaway is that when you overall look at the numbers right across the board, that people are more likely to report that they will be volunteering or have been volunteering less in the post-pandemic period than in the pre-pandemic period. And this speaks to what I'll call it, the stress that many arts and culture organizations are under, and nonprofits and charities, and the other research that we've done, just trying to have volunteers and to keep volunteers engaged in the post-pandemic period. What's interesting is that when we asked about top motivators, at least among culture goers, on why they volunteer, there was a great big long list, a quite diverse list, because this was an open-ended question and those individuals could say whatever they liked. But the most popular ones that people tended to cite was the view that they volunteered because it aligned with their interest, that they had schedule flexibility that would be a top motivator, that their values align with the organization, and the whole idea of being part of the community and with other volunteers, and those being kind of the key motivators that culture goers had identified for engaging in volunteer activities with arts and culture organizations. On the benefits front, actually, it was a little more stark and focused. You can see that altruism, or contributing, giving back to the community, was cited by 44% of culture goers as one of the most attractive benefits of volunteering for an arts and culture organization. And then after that came applying and sharing knowledge, learning some new stuff, and meeting new people. And I guess what this puts into focus is an environment where people are reporting that they will be volunteering less than in the pre-pandemic period. However, one of the top things that makes them attracted to volunteering has to do with giving back to the community, with this whole idea of being altruistic. Now, if you remember back before, when we looked at the minority of those that said that they had volunteered, the good news is, as you can see, this openness to volunteering in the next 12 months is actually at 52%. So the positive news on that front is that there are opportunities, at least, for arts and culture organizations to engage volunteers on a go-forward basis. And I would hazard to say that, based on the research, appealing to their altruism and interest in their wantingness to connect with other volunteers would be key key motivators. That said, you can see on the left-hand side, when we talk about an approach, special events or projects tends to be the thing that people are interested in most, while only 13% would prefer a reoccurring engagement on a regular basis, 12% volunteering on a board. It's like everything, right? It's the right volunteer opportunity for the right individual is probably the key takeaway. But I think what I see in the numbers, at least at this particular time, is that engaging and motivating volunteers on an altruistic basis to support arts and culture in their community is probably more appealing if it kind of rallies a community of interest around a special event or a project. So, what are the key takeaways? Volunteers are tight and in demand. People are volunteering less, especially among women compared to the pre-pandemic period. But there's an opportunity, at least, where half of arts and culture goers report that they're open to volunteering, but are more likely to want to volunteer for a special event or gathering. And maybe with that, Aubrey, I'll stop and pass it over to you.
Thanks. I like that positive summary at the end. There's potential volunteers out there waiting for us. So thanks, Nick. If anyone has any technical questions about the data or methodology, Nick will be happy to answer those in the chat during our discussion. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists who will give their take on the research findings from their own individual organizations. First up, we have Mab Coates-Davies, who is a museum professional raised in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Toronto, Ontario. Mab has a bachelor's in public history from Concordia University and is passionate about storytelling and creating meaningful and inclusive experiences for museum communities. As the Senior Manager of Visitor Experience and Operations at the Textile Museum of Canada, they oversee multiple revenue streams, manage a 150-person volunteer team, and drive operational improvements. They are also on the executive committee of the Toronto Association of Volunteer Administration, TAVA, and are passionate about creating change in volunteer management. They're also currently pursuing a master's degree in nonprofit leadership and philanthropy at Carleton University. So welcome, Mab. Next, we have Drew Delbaere, who is a volunteer engagement professional and arts administrator from Edmonton, Alberta. For the past 5 years, he has worked as the manager of volunteer engagement with Fringe Theatre, where he coordinates a team of up to 1,000 volunteers for the Edmonton International Fringe Theatre Festival. He also volunteers himself as the co-chair of the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra and Winspear Center's Young Leadership Council. In this capacity, he develops programs to attract younger audiences to the symphony and advocates for the priorities and perspectives of younger generations. Drew holds a certificate in volunteer administration through the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. It's a bit of a mouthful. So welcome, Drew. We also have from the East Coast with us, Andrea Dawson Thomas, who is the Executive Director of the Halifax Jazz Festival and has a longstanding relationship and history with the arts community in Atlantic Canada, having dedicated over 20 years to leading event administration, operations, and production in music, film, and theater. She previously worked at the Atlantic Film Festival, East Coast Music Awards, and Magnetic North Theatre Festival, and is experienced in nearly every facet of nonprofit business. As a generous contributor to the creative industries, Andrea has volunteered her time for numerous boards, including Music Nova Scotia and Citadel Theatre Arts Society. All right, so welcome to all three of you, and we're going to dive into our questions. Let's start with a sort of general trends. Naturally, there was a severe drop in volunteerism during the pandemic when arts facilities were closed, and now we are 3 years out from that. The majority, 59% of volunteers said they are back to contributing about the same amount of time as before the pandemic. So that's pretty good news. However, 1 in 4, 24%, are volunteering less or somewhat less than before the pandemic. Can each of you describe whether this drop has been noticeable at your organization and what you attribute it to? Whoever wants to jump in first there.
I can go first.
Okay.
So thank you so much for having me today. This is fantastic. So at the Textile Museum, we have been pretty consistently pre the pandemic and now at around 150 volunteers. But where I have seen the drop is in the number of average hours. So our average hours per volunteer before March 2020 were around 54, and now we're seeing it more at 37 hours per year. So I attribute that shift to multiple factors at our organization. Definitely people's lives changed drastically during the pandemic. That took some people, actually moving out of Toronto or just getting to a time in their lives where they weren't able to or didn't want to regularly commute downtown to the museum. But also we transitioned our volunteer program from being volunteer-led and managed to being under staff supervision in 2020, right before the pandemic. So that was a really big shift for us and meant that we essentially redesigned and rebuilt a volunteer program in the last 3 years. So that program's kind of focus for us has really been on breaking down barriers to volunteering. So while it's really fantastic when we see, volunteers contributing large regular, a regular number of hours, our focus has really been on expanding that capacity to be a more accessible volunteer position to many different audiences, and that's been our priority. So yes, we've seen a bit of a drop in those numbers of hours, but there's many factors for us at play there. And another one is that we've been kind of reassessing what should be paid labor and what should be volunteer roles within our institution. And so that's kind of changed around the responsibilities of volunteers. We've definitely asked our volunteers to go through a lot of change with us in the last couple of years. And so we're really happy that so many of them have stayed with us, and we've been able to welcome in many new people as well.
Great. Okay, and Drew at the Fringe?
For sure, yeah. So at the Fringe, we canceled our 2020 festival, but we did have a small hyperlocal festival in 2021 and had more of a larger scale festival in 2022 and just this past summer in August 2023. And I would say that we have noticed similar trends that, we had fewer volunteers in 2021 and 2022. But this past year, we saw a lot of folks who had last volunteered with us in 2019 return to our festival. So definitely seeing the numbers bouncing back. We've had lower numbers, but we've still been able to fill all positions because we've needed less volunteers due to some changes in technology and some efficiency we found. We've been able to operate with less volunteers and make those roles more meaningful for the people who are there. So we've been able to fill all of our positions with less people. And something else that I'll add on too is I think something that it's not unique to the arts industry, but that all volunteer involvement organizations have seen is that organizations that delayed that relationship or let the relationship go with their volunteers during the pandemic are struggling a lot more. And specifically, I'll call out the organizations that let their volunteer managers go during the pandemic, that let their staff go, furloughed them. I think those organizations, in particular, are really struggling to rebuild their volunteer programs because volunteer engagement is all about relationship building. And when you don't have someone stewarding those relationships, just like you would with a donor, it's, the people have found other things in their lives to do, priorities have changed over the last few years, and they don't feel as connected to some organizations. So, at Fringe here, I feel very lucky that I was kept on in my position during the full 3 years. And because of that, I was able to steward those relationships and keep people engaged, even when we couldn't have them actively volunteering in person. So I think that's important. And if you're an organization that did let somebody go or you didn't have anybody in a volunteer engagement role for a couple of years, you're really looking at starting back, building up that program from the ground up sort of thing and re-engaging those people and building that relationship again. So I think that's something important to consider as people look to increase their volunteer numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. It's really all about relationships. So Andrea, what's the trajectory you've been through at the Jazz Festival?
So very similar. We certainly saw a decline when we returned last year in 2022. We were sort of the first major event that came back after the pandemic, and folks were still hesitant to gather in large events or in large environments. But this year, fortunately, we saw our numbers increase closer to pre-pandemic levels, although not quite there. I think one of the benefits is that we are a special event. I think it was also noticeable that we had actually a larger percentage of new volunteers this year than we typically would see. We definitely did lose folks for a number of reasons. Some of that was aging out. Definitely there is a trend where people are very particular about their time and need to feel that their time is valued. One of the reasons that I think we were able to get back to those levels is that we were fortunate in this region that we were able to do some in-person events during the pandemic period. So we had the opportunity to engage volunteers and maintain some momentum through that period, although certainly not the same scale. Yeah.
Yeah, great. This is all good things that we've started with that I think we're going to dig into and unpack a lot more in subsequent questions. So, Drew, you just came off the most recent Edmonton Fringe Festival, which is Canada's largest. And Fringe festivals are all over the world, and they all rely on huge teams of volunteers to make that Fringe experience come to life. Can you tell us briefly about some of the indispensable things volunteers contribute to the Edmonton Fringe?
Yeah, for sure, Aubrey. So at Fringe, volunteers are embedded in all parts of the organization. And you might be wondering, how does a small staff team of just a few in our volunteer department manage 1,000 people? And that's because we have different layers or different roles for volunteers. So we have a role called team leaders that manages one of our 14 different volunteer teams. And those team leaders are who we work most closely with. So they give their time and talents year round to us to help with the preparation, planning. And now this year, this time of year in the cycle, we're moving into our reflection and reporting sort of things now that the festival is completed. And then a majority of those volunteers, though, we have out of the 1,000 are episodic volunteers, are the ones who are coming in for the event themselves and participating. And in all parts of the festival, anything from selling a ticket, scanning at the front of house, at the doors of the theaters, providing information, providing first aid services, helping with our Kids Fringe, our Children's Festival. And we've seen some new roles this year as well. We've expanded to include volunteers in an accessibility capacity. So providing buddies for volunteers to make our volunteering team more accessible to people. And we've also added volunteers into our community care team. So that's helping to recognize that our festival is in the middle of a city. We are in a place with many unhoused individuals, and that we displace those individuals unintentionally during the festival. And so our community care team helps to ensure those individuals still are cared for and that they have access to resources and food and water and things like that while we take over some of their space for 11 days in the summertime. So our volunteer roles, they adjust and they evolve with the festival needs like every year.
But it certainly seems obvious that the festival is not possible without that amazing, huge team of volunteers. By contrast, the Textile Museum turns to volunteers all year round for support, not principally during that intensive period as described by Drew. In brief, Matt, can you tell us how you work with a year-round roster of volunteers at your museum?
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. So at the museum, volunteers support us in many different areas. So they work at our reception desk and our gift shop. They give tours, which we've just started up again, as well as special events and selling memberships. And one of the major changes that we were able to make during COVID was to bring an off-site fabric storage area that we had in downtown Toronto on-site to the museum's second floor. So totally renovating the space, and we made the Learning Hub, which is a really active maker space where visitors can come to buy affordable fabric, try a new craft with some volunteer or staff support, or do their own craft work using our sewing machines or looms. So this has been really popular. We've been really excited about this. And it's been a great space to have a volunteer team in because it's very social and it really lends itself to having volunteers who specialize in different areas of textile arts. So having a whole group there is fantastic for when visitors come in. It also allows for a lot of flexibility with shift timing because while we like to have people in there as much, it's not a space that needs to have someone in it at all times necessarily, or needs to have a volunteer there. We also do an annual fabric sale as our major fundraiser. So volunteers are really integral to that sale. They support us for weeks in advance with sorting and pricing fabric and lugging bags around. And then of course on the day too. And in terms of how we work with them year round, so it's basically me and one other staff member who are dedicated to volunteer support. And then we have staff supervisors in each department We did have volunteer team leads, like Drew was talking about, prior to the pandemic. We haven't quite felt the need for that, but we might bring that back in at some point. And we find that staff buy-in is super important to making sure that volunteers feel supported and connected to the museum. It's also really important for us to have good communication between departments regarding volunteers and to be able to provide quick support when volunteers are on the ground with us. I also just want to talk about the importance of year-round communication. So we do monthly newsletters where we kind of highlight volunteer accomplishments and upcoming events and things like that. And we have meetings with the team specifically to let them know about upcoming exhibition content and things like that.
Yeah, sounds busy. Okay, so Andrea, what is the biggest draw for the Halifax Jazz Festival for attracting volunteers, and what experience or benefits are you offering to attract that team of 500 plus volunteers that you need each year?
I think in terms of the biggest draw, I mean, there's a number of things, but I think really partly it's the event itself. You know, it has a long-standing history and reputation as a community event. You know, people know about it. It's sort of the first event that kicks off the summer festival season. In terms of experience and benefits, I think, you know, speaking to the applying of sharing skills, we do have a variety of roles that really suit a variety of interests and abilities. You know, bartending, for example, is incredibly popular, but we also have finance roles. We have roles in technical and production, artist relations. And we really do encourage diversity. There really is a place for everyone who wishes to volunteer. Everyone is welcome to be part of the event. We also have team leads, and their roles they hold a higher level of responsibility. And I believe having that ownership over these areas that they are responsible for is really valued. You know, overseeing key areas like artist relations, the VIP program, the kids zone, merchandise and concessions. There's a real sense of pride and ownership and trust, and that's something that volunteers really appreciate and value. You know, in terms of benefits, you know, we host several volunteer events and looking to do more. So we do an orientation, and with that orientation, we do a social component so that people can reconnect with one another, or new people can meet one another. And we have some food and beverage. We do training sessions for our team leads. We have approximately 25. So we do a full training session in advance of the festival. We talk about new initiatives, event protocols. We do tabletop scenarios, things like that. We host appreciation events with food and beverage and live music. We have an annual volunteer award. It's voted on by their peers as well as the staff and board. Each department recognizes individuals and they receive a certificate of appreciation. At those events, we generally do door prizes. We also provide recognition for years of service, so milestone years 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. We usually give them tickets to our holiday show, and then we would also feature them in our program, so highlight them in our program and thank them from the stage. We obviously provide letters for employers or other programs for, you know, their participation as a volunteer. You know, during the event, there's a volunteer center with beverages and snacks, t-shirts. We give them access to shows, especially the headlining shows at the main stage, which is very popular and appealing to people. We also offer free transit through partnership with the municipality, coupons to various businesses. And I think,
Wow.
you know, yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot. There's so many reasons to volunteer for the Halifax Jazz Festival. But also, I mean, there's lots of tangible things, but clearly it's also about the recognition and gratitude that they get. So that's really brilliant. Just a reminder, everyone, that you can type your questions into the Q&A box if something comes to mind as you're listening to this section. So Drew, not only are you the volunteer manager at the Fringe, but you're also the co-chair at the Winspear Young Leadership Council. So clearly volunteerism is very, very important to you. Why? And what are you trying to achieve through really focusing on volunteerism?
Yeah, I would say volunteerism is something that has been important to me as I've grown up. And I never thought I'd be in this career managing and engaging volunteers, but I sort of just fell into it, as I think many people in this field do. I actually have a background in civil engineering. So look at that. And now I'm in the arts managing volunteers. But for me, I mean, part of my volunteer work is also a little bit of selfish in terms of that it's a bit of a professional development for me. I'm learning and seeing how other programs are operated. But I would say the big thing is some of the stuff that Nik was saying and the Nanos research. It's like, you know, a need to connect with community. It's a want to give back. And for me, it's a real desire to support the arts organizations in my city that I value so much. I value them. I want them to continue, and especially during a time of challenge like the pandemic and coming out of it. I want them to thrive and survive. I want them to still be around. I want more people to engage with them. I want the audience's houses to fill up. I know that's been a discussion in lots of arts organizations. Where did the audience go? And so, I want to be there to support all those things. And so that's why I often volunteer a lot of my time to the arts community, is because these organizations are important for me and important for the people that my friends and the other people that I engage with. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons. And then the secondary reason would be building community. I find that when I volunteered in university, I created a lot of friendships and a lot of community through that. And as I moved into my professional life, I was searching for that again. Where can I find that? How can I meet people that are like-minded? Things like that. So that was definitely something that was of interest to me when I was searching out volunteer opportunities. And that's why the Young Leadership Council was appealing, because it was people that were my age, were sort of like-minded, that I was like, I think I can make some friendships out of this. Because, you know, friendships don't always form out of volunteer opportunities. But that was when I was like, I think it can, and it definitely has for me.
Yeah, that's great. So actually, all your motivations really align with what Nik was presenting in the data. But the biggest one was really that similar to almost half of respondents saying that the top benefit for volunteering was feeling like they were contributing or giving back to their community. And that is a pretty powerful statement. So I'd like to turn to you, Andrea and Mabe, to see how are you leveraging that value of community building in your volunteer engagement strategies? Maybe you first, Andrea.
Sure. I mean, the festival's been around for a long time. The majority of our programming is free, and we engage in various public spaces around the city. So there's a lot of awareness of the event, which gives us an opportunity to engage with folks that may be interested in sharing their time with us through volunteering. We also engage with a lot of community organizations, underserved communities in particular. So there's a lot of opportunity there to connect with people, and again, create opportunities for them to connect to the festival. There really is, we're really fortunate to have this kind of foundation, and there really is a strong community feel to the event, which makes it easier for us to connect and reach out to people. It often really feels like a summer camp when everyone comes back together after being away from each other for a year. Honestly, it's such a lovely feeling. Everybody's just so excited to be back and so excited to be part of something so significant in the city.
Mm-hmm. And you, Mab, how does the Textile Museum leverage that sense of community building?
Well, it was definitely something we felt a ton with volunteers who, kind of stayed with us while we were shut down, that we saw a lot of isolation. We saw a lot of volunteers who were really eager to get back into the museum physically, even when that wasn't possible, in order to see fellow community members. And we know that that's a core reason that people volunteer with us. And we do talk about community building in our screening sessions with volunteer applicants, but I don't find we're really lucky to get a lot of applications. And I don't find we're really in a position where we need to leverage community building in order to attract people, because our whole ethos at the museum is about providing space and shared learning between textile artists, enthusiasts, and makers. And hopefully volunteers can really see that before they apply with us. So we find that volunteers usually come to us with a real passion for textile arts. And so our focus is kind of more on making sure that we can support that passion for both textiles and the museum, and to create shared learning opportunities between the museum and between volunteers and the public. But that being said, we are making much more of an effort to make sure that any marketing of our volunteer program features a diversity of volunteers, so that any potential volunteers can see themselves and their communities represented and reflected in our program's mission.
Well, that actually is a really good segue, because I was going to ask you next about the demographics of the volunteers at your organization. You said you did a pretty big restructuring, so I assume that probably you've seen some shifts in those demographics over the past couple of years.
Yes, absolutely. So many parts there. I could talk about that restructuring for so long.
Oh, I think we've Nav has frozen for a second. So while we wait for her to come back, Andrea, after the festival is done for the season, how are you keeping ties with those volunteers, and how do you keep them engaged and excited to come back next year?
So historically, we've had a volunteer manager on contract, so not a year-round person. So basically, once their contract ended, there was little communication until recruitment started for the next festival. We certainly understand that it's so important to nurture our relationship with our volunteers. And so recently we hired a staff person, and one of their responsibilities is to provide year-round volunteer engagement. So that includes things like ongoing training sessions. So not just once a year, but throughout the year. Doing social activities as well, staying connected through regular communications, follow-up surveys, one-on-one meetings, newsletters, providing updates on invitations to year-round events and activities, as well as insider information in advance of public announcements. We also, as I mentioned, milestones before, so that milestone recognition as well as birthday recognition throughout the year. Volunteer features in our newsletter year round, so that we're constantly talking about the people that engage with our festival and make it happen. So that's not just a once a year thing.
Yeah.
We also have opportunities in the year, but it's on a much smaller scale. So that also would help us to stay engaged and keep that communication open, to remain connected to our volunteers.
Yeah, great. So we've got Matt back again. So you were just starting to talk about the demographics at the Textile Museum. I'll let you pick that up again.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I got kicked out for a second. So basically, we don't have a ton of historical data around our volunteers' ages, but I did just pull what our current kind of average is, and it's 54 years old. So anecdotally, comparing that to pre-COVID years, I would say that that's much lower, and that prior to the pandemic, most of our volunteer base would have been retired. So that's one shift for us. We've also been working with the Institute for Canadian Citizenship for a number of years, and have been doing advertising through their Canoe program, which welcomes newcomers to Canada. And so we're seeing a rise in our newcomer volunteers as well. And one thing I also wanted to highlight is that prior to the pandemic, there was a membership requirement to be a volunteer. So you had to purchase a Textile Museum membership, which meant that volunteers were spending at least $65 a year on that, which was an obvious barrier for some folks to volunteer. So once we removed that, we immediately started to see a demographic shift. And we're now seeing a younger and more racialized volunteer base grow at the museum.
Yeah, that's good news. I mean, textiles are universal. We all have some connection to them. So there's no reason why it can't appeal to everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so as we saw in the data, 1 in 2 culture goers say they were open or somewhat open to volunteering. Very good news. Nowadays, though, free time is regarded as a precious commodity. So for all of you, how do you get someone who is somewhat interested to actually commit to giving their time? So maybe Drew, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think, volunteer recruitment at the end of the day is marketing. That's all that it is. And I think we need to do a better job as an industry of marketing ourselves to our audiences and to the community. And I think that one of the shifts I've seen, and it's supported by the data that Nik presented earlier today, is how do we talk about volunteer opportunities and why you want to volunteer? I think a lot of the traditional ways where, hey, come and, get a free ticket or get access to this thing, or we'll give you a meal. And those are all things we definitely do at our festival as well. But we've shifted our messaging these days to talk about value alignment and to talk about impact. What impact are you going to have by volunteering with us? How are you going to contribute to the arts community, to artists' individual lives? How are you going to how is your time going to be valued by the organization? And then also value alignment too, right? So what are our values as an organization? And do you see yourselves reflected in that, right? We talk a lot about our safer spaces, our anti-racism commitments, things like that, and how that builds part of our community. And so I think also by leading with those sorts of messaging, you are engaging in a deeper level of engagement with your volunteers. You're finding people who are not just coming for the free ticket, but who are going to stick around for 4 or 5 years, maybe because they really align with the values of your organization and they really care about the mission and the vision that you have. And so not only are you going to find a body to fill a position, but you're going to find somebody who's easier to retain as well, because they are so much more committed to you because they agree with what you're doing and they really want to support it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that retention rate stays higher. And Mab, do you have any thoughts about this too?
Yeah, I loved what Drew said. Thank you for that. So yeah, a lot of my answer is the same, but we have become very, very flexible with when volunteers start. So it's pretty common for us to have kind of an initial question or initial conversation with applicants, and then kind of tell us, like, say, whenever you're ready to start, let us know, and then to welcome them in at that point. We also find that giving potential volunteers the opportunity to speak with current volunteers can be really positive. We have some amazing advocates in our volunteer program for the program itself. And so I think overall our program is kind of less focused on converting people who aren't so sure, but really about finding a good fit for the applicant and for the museum. So and we say that in our screening session. So making sure that there is, like Drew was talking about, some really core value alignment there. And it's really important for us to have the expectations of the role be super clear on both sides. So we make sure that what applicants are assuming the role will be, we'll make sure we've kind of clarified that with them. But we're in a really privileged position. Like you said, the kind of universality of textiles means that we get a ton of volunteer applications. We definitely did see a drop in the 2020 to 2021 phase, but with the opportunity to kind of rebuild the program, we are seeing high levels of applications again. And so I found that kind of having the structure in place to really focus on relationship building between staff and volunteers keeps them really anchored and connected to the museum's mission and values, providing that flexibility, and then focusing on kind of a barrier reduced screening and application process has been really important for us.
Mab and Drew have covered a lot there, Andrea, but is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I completely agree with both Drew and Mab. I think they covered it off very well. I do think, talking about the impact that the organization is making to the community, I think it's really important to tell those stories from a volunteer perspective, but also from the other stakeholders that benefit from the organization. So, yeah.
For sure. So briefly, because we do have some very good questions waiting from the audience. The survey showed that 1/3 wanted to volunteer for special events or projects, and only 1 in 10 roughly said they preferred a recurring engagement. A similar number were interested in volunteering for the board, and we have to remember board members are volunteers. So can everyone sort of touch on this, how this aligns with your experience, and is there something you're leaning towards with your volunteers? It's some kind of pipeline to get people from those special events into more recurring, or even over to the board eventually?
Sure, I can start off again.
Yeah.
I would say we're a little unique in that we don't have necessarily that pipeline built. We don't have a lot of year-round opportunities. We do have a small usher team that supports the shows that are in our theater spaces year-round, but we only need about 25 people for that. And when you're pulling from a group of 1,000, those spots easily get filled up. So, but I am noticing that people's commitment and how much time they want to give, that is definitely changing and shifting. We have a 4-shift commitment over our 11-day festival. And, we always get requests of, well, can I just do 2? Can I do 3? I can only volunteer for 1 day. And as of right now, we've been lucky that we're able to kind of stick to that commitment, because we are able to fill our volunteer positions. But I know other organizations in the events and festival sector are looking at what would a 1-day commitment look like. How do you get the person in the door and then level up their involvement so they volunteer for one day for the first year, and then they volunteer the whole weekend the next year, for example. So definitely something to consider. And I would say that my experience anecdotally is that here in Edmonton, or at least the Alberta community, is that there's a real challenge in terms of recruiting board members. Right now, I think people are not wanting to take on the liability, the responsibility. There's a lot of difficult conversations going on in the arts community in many organizations, and it's hard to fill those positions. And there's a big time commitment for those as well. So I think your existing volunteer pool is definitely a great place to pull upon, but sometimes you're looking for specialized skill sets for board positions. And so I can acknowledge it can be challenging. I don't necessarily have an answer for that one.
Yeah, Andrea, you're the executive director, so you work directly with the board. You want to pick that up and continue? We do have a question from the audience asking how you activate and engage your board members.
So in terms of what Drew just said, yeah, I absolutely agree. It is challenging to find the right people for the board that are able to commit the time and that are willing to, take the risk with, the way that arts organizations are. We've been really fortunate. We have a really strong board, but there certainly are vacancies that, we would like to see filled that we, haven't been able to fill for sure. We have had board members come from volunteering for sure, which is great. Again, we have a really, really engaged board, so much so that they participate in the event fully. They all have different roles and responsibilities. As I said, that they run the volunteer appreciation event. They're there on site every day participating. They will be scanning at the gates. They will be selling drinks at the bar. That's just it's the culture of that particular board. So I am very fortunate. I'm not sure, I've never had to work at engaging them. I think they just really, though everybody that is on this board really aligns with the values of the organization and is really committed and dedicated. And I think the board nomination committee has done a really excellent job of finding people that will make that kind of commitment.
I certainly know anecdotally across the sector, lots of organizations are struggling with it, recruiting and retaining board members. So it is a fairly wide experience. We've talked a lot about values when it comes to volunteering, but that is also language that is used a lot in fundraising. We have a question here about how much overlap is there between volunteers and donors, and is there movement between those two groups for your organizations? Maybe let's start with Mav on this one.
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, by virtue of removing that membership requirement, it used to be that all volunteers were donors. So we have definitely seen that shift a little bit. But in terms of the other direction, donors moving towards becoming volunteers, that happens as well. And that's a really nice thing for us, having people engaged in, multiple different facets of the organization.
Yeah.
One of my I was going to say, one of my favorite phrases on this is donors are volunteers and volunteers are donors. I don't have the specific studies in front of me right now, but there are lots of studies out there that show that those two groups are very much aligned. The people that want to give their time and care about the organization are also going to choose to give their money if they're in a position to do so, and vice versa. So, I mean, if you're in an organization where the volunteer side is getting cut, but the fund development side is still getting funded and still getting well supported, that's something to go advocate to say, hey, but our volunteers are donors and our donors are volunteers. And these two things are very connected, and we need to support them equally and make sure they're both well resourced, because they both, depend on each other for success in many ways.
Andrea, any thoughts about that too?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly see, we're really fortunate. We have a number of partners who donate to the festival, but they also bring their volunteers their staff to volunteer for the festival. So they engage with the festival, not just financially, but they actually get to participate in giving back in that way. So we have a number of partners who actually do that, and there's a lot of value. And for them, they feel even more of a connection than just writing that check.
Great. Okay. So a nuts and bolts question for you. People are asking about what systems or programs you use to manage those volunteers, especially the volunteer benefits aspects. So maybe Drew, you got 1,000 volunteers to manage. What systems are you using?
Oh yeah, the systems question is always fun. So we use Better Impact as our volunteer management system. Getting some nods. I think some other organizations use that. It's pretty popular in Canada. But we also built on, I know the question specifically asked about tracking benefits. And we built our own in-house system called Volunteer Time Clock that we use as sort of a shift management system during our festival to track people's signing in and out of shifts, track their volunteer hours, and also track their benefits. Are they collecting their T-shirt, their pin, their ID badge, all of those sorts of things. So I don't know, tech is an interesting one all the time. The volunteer management systems, they are progressing slowly. Some of them are getting better. There's new ones out there, but I would say that it's still a part of technology that's under-resourced. At the moment, you're not going to find a lot of cutting edge volunteer systems that have all the bells and whistles you're going to find with some of the big, Google and Meta and those platforms with all the fun things they have, just because there's not a lot of money in it necessarily. But Better Impact is what we use, and then our own custom built one through some grants we received actually from Canada Council for the Arts.
Yeah. Okay. For you, Matt, you're in Ontario. There's a requirement in our province for high school students to actually do a certain number of set volunteer hours. Are you tapping into that?
Yes, that's a great question. So we tend to tap into that more for special events than for regular reoccurring volunteer opportunities. Not because we wouldn't want to have high school volunteers with us, but just because they generally happen to be kind of during the school day. But during events, we do see volunteers from high school programs coming in, and we've seen those people returning to us as well pretty repetitively. So that's been great for us.
Great. Okay. Do any of you ever deny an application from a volunteer? And have you ever fired a volunteer? And if so, why?
Fun question.
No.
I can talk about that.
Sure.
So yes, our screening process we've really workshopped it, particularly with support from Volunteer Toronto. And I've changed it around many, many times with feedback from volunteers and from our staff as well. It's not a really long process because we want to make sure we're not kind of making it feel like a total interview for volunteers. So we tend to keep them around like 20, 25 minutes. But if in that we make an effort not to outwardly offer a volunteer opportunity during that screening session. So we always give the staff members in the screening a chance to do a debrief. And if there are any flags with the fit not feeling right, then we will typically direct, it hasn't happened that many times, but I will direct the volunteer back to Volunteer Toronto to look through their postings for something that might be kind of better suited. Again, it's all about expectation management for us. So if we feel that the person coming in doesn't have the kind of right idea around the expectations of the position and might not be able to manage it, we don't want to set ourselves or them up for the disappointment of not being able to function in that role.
Andrea, or Drew, go ahead.
Sure, I was going to add on. I would say that volunteer screening is a super important part of the process. One of the phrases we hear a lot here and through Volunteer Alberta is screening volunteers in, not out. So you're not looking at it as a process for how do you make sure people are coming into your organization and it's a good fit, and it's not, not saying like, oh, we don't want these folks or things like that. So in terms of firing volunteers, I mean, absolutely, it happens. Sometimes that's why we have those volunteer code of conducts. We have expectations for people, and people break rules sometimes, and we have to say sorry. This is not how we expect you to behave, and you're not welcome to continue volunteering here. So it has happened occasionally in the past. We have a list of folks that have had some disciplinary action, but for the most part, having those clear expectations, make sure that that people can meet them, right? That if you're really clear about what your expectations are with volunteers up front, you avoid things escalating to that point typically.
Yeah, great. So we have a question from someone at a not-for-profit arts organization that is just starting their volunteer program for the first time. So do you have any advice on how to get started and recruit volunteers when, it's brand new for them? Andrea, do you have any suggestions?
Brand new. Well, I think, going back to that awareness piece, the marketing piece, telling your story, engaging with the community to let them know what the value is to participate with your organization. I think connecting with other organizations that have volunteer programs, speaking with them, perhaps tapping into their database, their community, to engage them in your event. I think those are good places to start for sure.
Can I add on to that question too?
Of course.
So I really would recommend connecting with other volunteer managers, because volunteer management is a super heavy role in a lot of ways. It contains a lot of emotional labor, and finding that support network to support yourself through that process of starting a new program is really important. A quick plug for TAVA, which is the organization that I'm involved with here. There are many AVAs throughout Canada and the United States that provide those kind of mutual support networks for volunteer managers. Also, I would say, like, really clearly building every aspect of your program before starting any kind of onboarding process, making sure you have all the answers to those questions, like Drew was talking about. What if you have to fire a volunteer? What does that look like for you? And also making sure that your database, which we also use Better Impact, is set up correctly. This is still something I'm struggling with, because we still don't have a lot of historic data. And so capturing everything you might need for giving a presentation like this in the future is really, really important.
Yeah,
I would say be strategic about it. Don't just jump into it and start recruiting volunteers. I mean, you have to have a quality experience when those volunteers arrive. Otherwise, they're not going to stick around. So, it's not worth a lot of time up front trying to find all these folks to come and join you if when they come, they're like, this is disorganized, I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't feel well supported, and I wasn't trained, and I don't know who to provide feedback to, and I don't feel like my time's being valued. And if they feel any of those things, they're going to leave. And so you got to get all those things in order first before you started welcoming people to a volunteer program or to a volunteer role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked a lot about volunteer appreciation. We have a comment here from someone who said they used to do a big volunteer appreciation banquet once a year. Their budget has been cut completely, and now working on a shoestring or almost impossible budget to throw this kind of event. So two parts really question: what can you do on a shoestring to really show that appreciation? And second part is, how do you really create a culture in your organization where these appreciation moments matter to those who manage the whole organization and not just the volunteer department?
One of the things I would first comment is I would challenge you to consider other more cost-effective ways that you can still recognize volunteers. I think that the idea of a volunteer banquet may have a lot of history to your organization. It'd be something you're really sad to lose, and I completely understand that. But I think for a lot of volunteers, I think there's a lot of shift away from the sort of big annual appreciation luncheon. Like, there's a lot of movement to recognizing people in different ways. And I think the recognition needs to be tied to their motivation. So why are they volunteering there? Is it for community? In which case, some of those events can be helpful, but how do you do them in different ways? And I'll give you an example of this. In last year's in 2022 festival, we recognized that community was a big part of why people volunteer, and something we wanted to continue fostering. So we implemented late night karaoke at our festival. Of course, we're an arts and theater festival, so we took one of our theater spaces, we opened it up to our volunteers and staff, and we had a karaoke party. Didn't cost us a lot to do, but was once again a community building piece. But that's the motivation for people who are wanting to be community orientated and are volunteering for that reason, but the people volunteer for other reasons as well, right? So can you tie into other things? And my other plug I'll give for volunteer recognition is I don't think there's anything more powerful than a thank you card. especially if it is personalized to that individual. It's not just a generic sort of like, thanks for volunteering, but if it's like, thank you for doing this thing and making this impact on our organization, I think that goes a long way and doesn't have a lot of cost associated with it. So
Yeah,
I know maybe that's like a
absolutely.
sideways answer from, how to pivot when you don't have the budget, but that's some ideas I have.
Absolutely. These days, especially when you don't get any real mail, getting a real thank you card feels very special. So, Andrea, do you have anything to add on that regard?
No, I completely agree with Drew, and I do value the mail, the thank you card. People really do appreciate it. Yeah.
Mab, we've got one question for you about, you described that shift from the volunteer-led program to a staff-led volunteer program. They're wondering if you got any pushback. And then someone also commented that they went through that too, and want your thoughts on how to engage those lead volunteers that used to kind of lead the program, how to keep them appreciated and engaged, even though you've transitioned.
Definitely got a lot of pushback. It was not an easy time at all because we were really breaking down a power structure that had existed for the entirety of the museum's life, so almost 50 years. And some people were really upset with us, and some people weren't. Some surprising people weren't too. And so we really kind of found those advocates. There are many ways I would do it differently if I was doing it again, actually. And I would love to talk to other people who've had that experience. It was a very emotional, process for us. But I think, kind of leading from a place guided by principles of anti-oppression, engaging someone like to come in. We eventually brought in Wendy Ng from Twin Muses to support us in kind of setting up some of the pieces of it. And that was really helpful. So developing our volunteer code of conduct, kind of conveying like, what do we anticipate and expect from volunteers, and what are we also presenting as our volunteer program was really important. So coming up with a very clear structure, kind of showing them the way forward in our program. But it also was really slow. Like, it took time. Even introducing Better Impact as a system, I think I maybe gave 3 presentations just on Better Impact to the volunteer body. So those pieces were important. I think in probably any kind of those transition periods, you are going to lose people. I feel like that's probably just part of it. And we just tried to make those transitions kind of as, it was authentic. It was like, do you want to be here, or is this not working? And that can be a space that people move towards. But I think also what we were able to do is really look at our volunteer program super critically, which was really important for us, and get feedback from a lot of staff members who were so involved in the program and were even before it was staff led, and really build up volunteer management in the organization as a critical role that staff play too. So I'm all for way more funding for volunteer management in order to make those programs work. It's critical.
And just quickly, Andrea, do you also use Better Impact, since we've heard both Mab? Yeah.
I certainly do. We've tried different volunteer programs that are part of a bigger event management program, but Better Impact is the best that we're able to find so far for our purposes.
Great. Okay. And lastly, Drew, you mentioned you started volunteering and then you moved into working as a volunteer manager. We have a question here that says, historically, there was a path described by many organizations where a volunteer could make themselves indispensable and then end up with a job. Are any of you still experiencing that kind of pipeline in your organization?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are so many people in our organizations that have started off volunteering. I have a really lovely story. We have somebody who works with us who started off volunteering with his mom when he was 6 years old. And he is now 22. and he works in the tech department. So he runs all of our audio video stuff. But when he was about 13 or 14, he really wanted to work on the stage, but the ED or the technical director at the time thought he was too young and didn't want to deal with a young kid. So the new technical director that came in said, the ED said to him, we have this kid that really wants to do this. And he's like, there's somebody that actually wants to work tech? This is fantastic. So he volunteered, and now he has a job working at the festival, and he also works in the tech and production industry now because of it. So it's a lovely story.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that I was going to touch on something very similar in my closing remarks, and at that time anyway, so I will get to it. When I was in high school, my mother encouraged me to go volunteer. She knew someone at the New Brunswick Museum. They connected me. I volunteered my Saturday afternoons for quite a few months at the New Brunswick Museum, and it was really exciting to see the inside of how a museum worked. And that's what really prompted me to pursue first a university degree in arts management and then a career in arts and culture. So I think we probably have all had these kind of transformational moments as a volunteer that and many people on the session too. So it can really be that spark that changes your life direction, opens new horizons, teaches you new things. So if we can all communicate that when we are trying to recruit volunteers, we are sure to connect with some new and exciting ones. So a big thank you to all of our panelists, to Andrea, Dawson, Thomas, Drew Delbaere, and Mab Coates-Davies for all your insightful responses and thoughtful ideas for recruiting those new volunteers and connecting with them and engaging them long-term, retaining them. Very exciting and interesting suggestions. Thank you to the National Arts Center and Nanos Research for continuing to partner with us on the Arts Response Tracking Survey in this new space. Also, thank you to David Bennett, who is continuing his support of this project. And a big thank you to Power Corporation of Canada, who is the presenting partner of the Business and Arts Speaker Series. If you want to learn more about any of our programs and events, you can head to Business and Arts website for more information, or you can follow us on social media. So many thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful day.